Cool, good afternoon everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So my name is Louise Burke and I'm the CEO at the Open Data Institute, and we're doing the session today on Reshaping the Web with Solid. I'm joined by Jesse Wright, who's in the middle there, Professor Pierre-Antoine Champon, which is at the end there, and Laurence de Backer, who's here beside me, and they'll introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about themselves in a few minutes. So what we're looking at is, imagine a web where individuals have control over their data. That's what we're going to explore. We're going to tell you a bit about Solid, which is a project that is now being stewarded by the Open Data Institute, and we took on the stewardship last October. And it's an open source initiative that's been founded by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who is also the founder of the Open Data Institute as well. Our focus at the moment, since we've taken the initiative on, is to actually put a governance structure in place so that we can have a very open and collaborative dialogue with the global community that supports Solid. Solid's been around for nearly 10, 11 years now. So there's a lot of people in the ecosystem that we will be working together in order to push the initiative forward. So enough from me. I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves. So I'm going to go across, first of all, to Pierre-Antoine.
Thank you, Louise. Hi, everyone. Pierre-Antoine Champin. I'm funded by INRIA, the French Research Institute for Computer Science, and there I work as a W3C fellow in the World Wide Web Consortium, the organization that standardizes web technologies. There, my focus is on data and knowledge on the web, and among other things, I'm the staff contact of the Linked Web Storage Working Group, whose goal is to standardize part of the bigger Solid initiative.
Thank you. And Jesse?
Thanks, Louise. I'm Jesse. I'm currently the Solid lead at the Open Data Institute, leading work on the open source initiative and on governance structures and on policy. And I also wear a hat working on ethical AI and web technologies in my research at the University of Oxford.
My name is Laurens de Bakker. I work as a consultant with the Flemish government and a solution architect on some of the practical production use cases we've launched in Flanders with the government using the Solid project over the last 2.5, 3 years. And I'm also the chair of the Linked Web Storage Working Group with the W3C, aiming to standardize the work of the Solid community and other like-minded initiatives all along the web.
Thank you, Laurence. So I'm going to start with you, Jesse, because Solid can be quite technical. If we don't have everybody technical out in the audience, it would be really good for you to explain Solid in plain English.
So very Solid aims to give you control over your personal data and to help you manage your personal data. And the way we do that is by giving you a piece of your personal cloud storage. And what you can do with that cloud storage is go to websites that you use today, like Facebook, Instagram, and rather than storing that data with the company, you instead store that data to cloud storage that you manage. What does that mean for you? 3 important things. 1, you can reuse that data. So if I put my email address, my physical address, my phone number, any data about me into Facebook, I get access to that data when I go to other applications that are built by other companies. So I get reusability of my information. I get better control over the consent and access management of my data. So if I want to revoke access of my physical address to all services that I use, I can do that rather than needing to go and update my management on every website out there. And you also get this universal identity, which we're already starting to see with things like Google Single Sign-On, where you have many websites that have this SSO mechanism for authentication. With Solid, every website, you can take this identity with you and log in to your personal cloud storage.
Great. So hopefully that was understanding for everybody. So I'm going to come to you, Pierre-Antoine. How does Solid seek to actually transform the web? We hear it's going to transform the web for us.
Yeah, so as Jesse described, the primary goal of Solid is to decouple a number of aspects that currently are tightly coupled in today's web application, and that is identity, storage, and application logic. So nowadays, when you want to use a brand new web application, you first have to create an identity that is a new identity that is specific to this application, and all the data you create is on the servers of this application. Actually, this is not entirely true. Jesse mentioned federated identity. Nowadays, web applications let you reuse existing identities from a limited choice of identity providers who still keep control over your identity. And the data storage is still under the control of the application. So with Solid, those three things become separate. This has impact on the users, as Jesse described. This also has impact on application developers. It is now possible for a new application to be created without having to care about managing their user's identity or managing their user's data. Which solves a number of problems like complying with regulations about personal data, and also the cold start problem. Applications can start by reusing data that's already there in their user storage, rather than let the user build their whole social network in order to get adoption.
Great, thank you for that. So I think it would be really interesting to get into some worked examples, and I'm going to ask Lawrence to talk about the use case that we've got in Flanders government at the moment.
Yeah. So over the past 2.5, 3 years, we've launched a couple of use cases in Flanders, coming from more of a governmental perspective, putting citizens in a situation where they can share educational credentials, data like their student enrollment status, like their verified university and high school degrees, and they can actually make that data available to potential employers in HR use cases. And we've rolled that out in a couple of bigger scale pilots with hundreds of users going up to thousands of users, together with larger established players like Randstad. We've seen those cases actually have very successful outcomes, both for the citizens as well as for the companies that were involved. They get their hands on verifiable information on the citizen in a structured manner. They can trust the information that they're getting from the government. They can automate and facilitate processes for the citizen. But what we also see is indeed that they don't have to set up their own data infrastructure. They don't have to go through all of these regulatory steps that you see, for example, in the context of GDPR. We try to build these into the ecosystems that we're setting up. So we've set up the infrastructure of providing a solid pod to the citizen. We've set up mechanisms around consent, but also the legal framework around data sharing, so that it is easy for these organizations to step into these pilots and start working with this new technology. And we're seeing that also in different areas, not only in Flanders, but also in the Netherlands now. There was a very successful pilot within the media landscape, where they established the Dutch Media Vault. They ran a 2-week pilot at the end of last year that involved 10,000 users across 5 different news websites in the Netherlands. The public broadcaster was involved, as well as 4 commercial players. And in that pilot, we actually also saw that 90% of the users that were involved actually reuse their data across multiple media providers. So you actually also see that value of having your data available not just in one platform, but being able to reuse it across these different use cases, these different players.
So looking at the government and the provision of the pods within Flanders,
yeah.
Do you think that was an important element? You know, listening to some of the panels today, they talk about trust, yeah. And sort of being supported. How important do you think that that has been to the success of the Flanders use case?
I think government has been a big driver of these ecosystems. I think the funding that came from us was critical for also getting the buy-in from these bigger players. Solid is, it might have existed now for a bit over 10 years, but it's still a very young technology. We're still in the process of properly standardizing it within W3C. So there was also a lot of hesitation with these bigger players. The buy-in that is coming from the government, it convinced businesses, large established players, to jump in. And on the other hand, it also afforded us a certain level of user trust. The government in Flanders still is a very trusted brand, according to research, with our citizens. And so citizens also trust the government in providing this kind of data infrastructure to them. So both from a business perspective as well as from an end user perspective, the involvement of the government, I think, was an important driver to this and to setting up this ecosystem.
Thanks for that, Lawrence. Jesse and Pierre-Antoine, anything to come in on use cases that you want to talk about?
Yeah, so there's a range of use cases that are being developed with Solid at the moment. Lawrence has talked about some of them. In the US, we're seeing use cases emerge around personal healthcare and personal management of health data. So there, the government has mandated that a lot of your health data now be available in the FHIR standard format. So companies are starting to emerge where people are porting their data, health records into personal data stores so that they can manage their health data and do analytics. Yeah, I think we should
Okay.
leave it there.
So I wanted to kind of move on because clearly, it's important that we have sort of positive impact, whether that's for the end user or for the economy as a whole. So looking at sort of governments and sort of the ecosystem and stakeholders around a deployment of Solid, what are the opportunities that maybe Lawrence has seen in Flanders or elsewhere?
Well, I think I see two main drivers of adoption for Solid, and this is also the perspective of our policymakers and the reason why they jumped on this opportunity. There's leveling the playing field from a business perspective, ensuring that our small and medium enterprises, that they can compete with these larger players, that they also have access to data infrastructure that's compliant with regulatory frameworks like GDPR. Also, there's the cold start problem that Pierre-Antoine discussed before. These large incumbents, these platforms, they have a lot of data. They are very mighty competitors for our European businesses. So from that perspective also, Solid technology can level that playing field, and that was an important driver. I think from an end user perspective, the aspects of user choice, transparency, and really implementing a framework of data protection that goes beyond the cookie banners and the simple implementations which don't really yield any transparency or any real form of control to end users. I think with Solid we're establishing a framework that can actually give them the controls and give them the information that they need to make more sensible, more informed decisions over how their data is being used.
Cool, thank you for that. I'm going to come to you, Pierre-Antoine. I want to ask you about, some people might say, oh, all my data in one place. Surely that's going to be a security issue.
So that's an important question, of course. There are many ways to respond to that. One of them is that all my data doesn't need to be in one place. So it doesn't mean that I have to have only one pod. Lawrence mentioned the questions of choice, the question of control over my data, but all of this is, of course, a trade-off. So some of my data might be on a pod hosted by the government with a lot of guarantees, or by a certified company. Other kinds of data might be on a more personal thing. Some people might actually want to host their own pod, tech-savvy people, obviously. And so not all my data has to be in one place. Not all my data has to be subject to the same trade-off in terms of privacy, security, control, transparency. Another way to answer to that question is that a place where just my personal data might not have the same incentive for attacks than huge databases where millions of users have their data at the same time. So the security risk exists also with big repositories of many users' data, which is different here for Solid. I mean, I'm less interesting of a target as a single user than all the users of, say, Facebook.
Yeah, good point, actually. So we hear a lot of conversation at the moment in the market about digital wallets. people are saying, oh, well, I have one of them, so that's kind of the same as Solid, some people might say. We also hear that the UK government is about to launch a digital wallet for driver's license credentials as a starter for 10. So where does Solid fit into the equation on that one? I'm going to come to you, Jesse, on that.
So I think the key distinction between wallets that are being talked about with IDAS, with the trust framework in the UK, and Solid is the wallet standards are talking about what the data looks like and how to sign the data. So when you look at the verifiable credential standards that back these digital wallets, they are talking about what, in the digital driver's license, what keys you need in that wallet to state the address, to state the date of birth, to state that this person is certified. But they do not talk about how or where the data is stored. And that is what Solid focuses on, is how to store and access that data so that it's reusable across applications. And to that end, Solid is complementary to data wallet standards as they exist, because it provides this storage solution where applications can access rather than needing what exists today, which is vendor-specific flows for how to send my digital driver's license from a Samsung wallet over to the DVA, or how to generate a QR code to share that driver's license. So it's providing a good way of sharing those credentials and other data.
Lawrence?
Yeah, I also think in these wallet ecosystems, a topic that hasn't been touched in many of these initiatives yet is the question of portability, something that you also touched, Jesse. If I have this entire set of credentials that is my digital identity, I also want to be able to move that kind of information to another wallet solution at some point in time. I might not have a Samsung phone anymore. I might be switching over to another brand of Android smartphone or to an iPhone. I want that level of choice. It not only extends to how my personal data is managed on the web, but I think it's very sensible to also expect that from this emerging landscape of wallet ecosystems.
Cool. And I think we don't necessarily know at this point, well, I certainly don't know, in the UK, what is the sort of plan for the delivery of the digital driving license as yet. It's been very much sort of a surface information that I've read on it. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But it is actually really important that we don't end up creating multiple solutions when actually it would be really good to have a single place where we can have that data, where we can make it available in order to meet the credential requirements that we might have for, I don't know, renting a car or proving our sort of identity when we go to a bar, although I don't need to do that anymore, I have to say, not for a while. I mean, that kind of brings us on. I mean, AI, everybody's talking about AI, so where is AI in the mix with pods and Solid and all of that? Don't know who wants to jump on that one. Yeah?
So, yeah, AI so far has benefited from those big databases of million users, as I've mentioned, and that, of course, Solid proposes to change this radically, because now those big databases would not exist anymore. On the other hand, the users could get much more value from having all their data available to them under the control, so that they can combine it, and some AI agent could then bring personalized insight and recommendation based on all my data, rather than having recommendations based on only the photos I shared and other people shared on that website, or only the music I listened to. So it changes things in that it shifts the usefulness of AI to be user-centric, which I think is really interesting. And it doesn't prevent, of course, users to consent to their data being available to other companies, so that they also can make more use of that by gaining more aggregated insight on what a community of users is doing. Not sure if you want to.
So one thing I'll note is that Anthropic and OpenAI, which are two of the big LLM players at the moment, are desperately building out solutions to access personal data. Anthropic's come out with the Model Context Protocol, where you can define how that model can access your Google Drive and your Dropbox and files on your personal device. OpenAI acquired a company called Carbon, which defines a series of custom pipelines to do exactly the same thing. So having a standard where you say to Anthropic, okay, I log in with my Solid pod, and all of my data is there, and I've defined the consents of what data I want you to access and what data I don't want you to access, means that these companies are able to do a lot of the personalized work for LLMs that they're trying to do at the moment.
Does it affect, though, the availability of data in the broad sense to train the models?
So this goes down the direction of, I guess, data trusts. So one thing that is interesting to do, say, in a healthcare setting, is to try and get data sets of cancer patients or other healthcare scenarios in order to train models for predictive analytics, for instance. What one can do with Solid is have a user define their consents for how they want their data to be used for research purposes in a reusable manner. So I permit any trusted academic institution to use my healthcare data for the purpose of predictive analysis, for instance. That can be built into part of a larger data trust solution, where data trusts then aggregate this data from the pods of a population to generate data sets for researchers to use. This is work that I'm starting to build out in my academic hat, but it is a very compelling use case for Solid.
Well, and it's really interesting to think, years ago, those who are as old as me would remember you held a donor card in your wallet. So if anything happened to you, your organs would be donated. I know it's all a bit digital now. But the idea of being able to potentially donate that data at a time where you might want to give back in order to extend the ability to do research is quite empowering to think about that. Indeed. And what that can do. Okay, so why does everybody not have a Solid pod?
Good question. I'll start, and then I think I'll hand over to Lawrence to talk about what's going on in Flanders. I think there's political and technical aspects to that question. The political drivers are that companies do benefit from having ownership and aggregation of data, especially prior to data protection laws existing. There was an incentive to have data silos, and thus it's just not within the market interests to have users completely controlling their data and making that data accessible to other companies. There's also the fact that it hasn't been standardized until now. We are just starting to go through the process of having a W3C charter and giving Solid the stamp of approval as a standard that companies should be using. And in a year and a half from now, that is going to be hopefully finalized so that companies know that this is a stable standard that they can use in production that has the same stamp of approval as HTML, which is what all of our browsers read, that has the same stamp of approval as the verifiable credential standards, which are being used as part of the digital wallet solutions. So it is now reaching a point of maturity where it is of interest for companies to start implementing it, such as in the Flanders use case, and I'll hand over to Lawrence.
Yeah, I think what we've done in Flanders is a few very controlled rollouts of Solid. I think 2 years ago I was on the stage in Austin where we talked about the first pilot of our Flemish use cases in the education domain, which when we were still talking about hundreds of pods. With our latest pilot, we've scaled it up to 10,000 pods. And at the end of February, we were going into production with It's Me, which is a large identity provider solution, EIDAS identity provider solution across Europe. And they're actually probably going to scale that up to hundreds of thousands of students who are enrolling for student jobs and have to prove that they have a valid student status in order to get certain benefits and reduced taxation of their employment. So we've done a very controlled rollout. Why have we done that in the first place? Because we also wanted to measure and gauge the attitude of our end users, of our citizens towards this new technology and this new way of giving users transparency and choice over their data. And on the other hand, there was still a lot of hesitation also from commercial players getting involved in these pilots because we were still lacking formal standardization, because we didn't have a body or a working group to actually do that standardization work in. Fortunately, since September, we now have a chartered working group, and we are moving towards that goal of getting a real proper recommendation level standard, hopefully in 1.5 or 2 years' time. So that ultimately is also increasing trust by these players stepping into these pilots to also do that scale up to bigger populations of users. That's what we're now seeing with It's Me in these education use cases. That's hopefully the next step after the pilot with the Dutch media vaults. So I'm quite confident that by this time next year, we might have use cases that go into hundreds of thousands of pods. And this technology gets into more people's hands, more use cases are being set up, and this will ultimately drive adoption of the technology.
Really exciting times. I mean, yeah, go on, sorry.
So I also wanted to point out that Solid is not the only initiative around the notion of taking back control of our data, of personal data cloud. I can think of a French company, I don't know how much it's visible outside, but Cozy Cloud has been selling this kind of solution for a while now in France, and there are other examples. So Solid itself is not the only initiative in that sense, and that's one of the reasons why the W3C working group is not just a Solid working group. It's called the Linked Web Storage Working Group. The idea is to really bring around the table all stakeholders, not just the Solid community, which has been quite visible, but again, not the only one working on this, to end up with a standard that has the most chances of being adopted widely. Mm-hmm. So it's not just about Solid, it's really about making this vision that several people have had in different places a reality.
Come together. I think one of the things that we worried about at the ODI was you don't want to disrupt an open community that's working really well together. But it did feel that Solid was at a point where if they wanted to unlock funding, which is the conversations that we're in at the moment, they needed somebody to be able to provide the sort of governance and compliance layer, and also to basically steward, I suppose is the word, to steward the community in order to achieve the maximum we possibly can from the Solid initiative. So, one of our, beyond just the governance consultation process that we're in at the moment, there is also the fact that we are fundraising. The community has been very positive about the Open Data Institute, which, as you know, is a not-for-profit organisation based here in the UK, taking on that responsibility. And it's, we have stewarded other standards as well. So we feel that we can get it right in order to make sure that it's a very sort of inclusive and collaborative and in the spirit of open. But there's other barriers that we need to overcome. And Jesse, I'm going to come to you to talk about some of those other barriers.
Yeah. Regulatory. There are a few challenges in the UK to getting adoption of things like Solid. One is making the data available, which I mentioned data silos before. How do we actually get companies incentivized to have users managing their personal data? One way we're starting to approach that through the Open Data Institute is through the Smart Data Act that's within the Data Use and Access Bill at the moment. So that is trying to extend this concept of open banking, which ODI was actually behind, to a range of industries to encourage companies to share data between one another about not only people but other parts of their business. And we at the ODI are recommending that this standard be extended to include business to customer data flows, we're calling it, to encourage businesses to make their data available to citizens so that you can import it into a pod and use it. And we're also starting to work out how do we encourage industry to handle consent and handle privacy better when it comes to data. And to that end, we're pushing on a data privacy framework to encourage companies to share consents, which is something that Solid supports as well. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Anything else from you guys? No? Okay. So I'm going to ask, before we kind of open it up to the floor for questions, a single call to action, Lawrence.
Well, I think the most important call to action I can give is with a bit of my W3C chair hat on, to get people involved in both looking at the use cases that they're realizing right now, the business that they're building and the value that they're delivering to their customers, and see whether Solid could fit into that, could provide solutions where citizens get more control, more transparency over their personal data and how it's used. To also get involved for those who are W3C members within the working group, and more broadly to follow the work that we're doing. Because there's very interesting things that are happening within the linked web storage ecosystem, within the Solid ecosystem, and that we definitely need more people's feedback on, more areas and problem domains that can chime in and see whether Solid could be a good fit for the problems that they're seeing or what we might still be missing.
This is certainly the right conference to ask for that. Jesse?
So I guess to extend on the challenges that I was going to talk about, there's, on the technical front of Solid, a very poor set of user experiences at the moment. Whilst the standard is getting to a point of maturity, it was a project that started 10 years ago. If you go and interact with a lot of the websites today, it looks like a website from 10 years ago. So we have a need in the community for more involvement from the front-end developers of the world, from the UI, the UX people, to give a good feel to end users outside of the use cases that have been built out by companies like Inrupt for particular customers and scenarios. Those use cases look good, but the default set of applications that you go to when you get pointed to work on the Solid project could look a lot better.
And some guidance
and some guidance. So yes, that's the other thing, is where we're in need to produce better education and training materials around Solid. We'll put up a slide at the very end that has a link to the Solid website and our email. And if you go to the Solid website, you may start to feel a little lost, because we need to build out that education and training material pathway. So if that's something you want to contribute to, we'd be very welcome.
Delighted.
Yeah, well, regarding W3C, Lorenz said most of it. Maybe one thing, so if you're a W3C member, feel free to join the working group. If you're not a W3C member, there's also a community group hosted by W3C, but open to anyone, and who's mostly incubating things about Solid, discussing things, and interacting closely with the working group. So it's really open to anyone, not just W3C members.
Great, thank you. Happy to open it up for questions.
Thank you very much. The promise is huge, I think, and for citizens, companies. And I'd be interested to know how, particularly, you can manage the risk associated with the currently digitally excluded proportion of our population, how you avoid further marginalisation. And I'd be interested, Lawrence, in the experience in Flanders.
Yeah, this is definitely a big challenge for governments. So in Flanders, we've always kept very strongly to the principle that there can be digital solutions, but there has to be a physical alternative. There still has to be someone that can help a citizen. We've worked very closely in rolling out these use cases with an initiative called the DigiBanks, which is basically a locally run initiative of people helping the digitally excluded get familiar, get accustomed with these digital tools, to also provide these trainings in locations that they know, like public libraries, like the town hall. So we've tried to work very closely with those kinds of initiatives. We also have worked out a set of documentation for our call center employees. Government of Flanders still has a physical number that you can call and that you can ask for help if something goes wrong. And also from that point, we can provide support when something goes wrong. So we do see that role of digital inclusion as a very important one when we roll out new technologies like this. We think that we're approaching it cautiously, and that we're taking care to also include these people that might not be as technologically savvy as the others.
Maybe not exactly to your question, but about people that are not technologically savvy. One important feature of Solid is that once my data is in my pod, it's meant to be usable by different applications. And it means that I can interact with this data with a different application depending on what kind of user I am. And so different people may use different application to interact with each other. Not everyone has to use the same application in order to communicate with one another. And so we could have applications more tailored to different kinds of people, different kind of users. Users that are tech savvy want a lot of control, a lot of options, and people that are not, and that need something more simple, more accessible. So that's also one of the promises of Solid, the interoperability of the data and more choice while keeping the ability to interact with each other.
Thank you. That's all really fascinating and inspiring, and we've been watching for those years, so it's great to see the progress. Thank you. Thank you. Notoriously, NHS is not very, let's say, famous for interoperability, and at times might be an issue of trusts having issues with connecting themselves and transferring data. So I wonder whether, well, of course, it's important to work with people individually and support them. What is the responsibility of anchor institutions, let's say, like you had in Flanders, but also maybe NHS or other providers that are maybe not private American data and health providers, who could take some responsibility over, let's say, hosting pods and also having some layer of communication between themselves, which they need to have anyway. And I know that they are working on it, but it doesn't feel like it's progressing very fast. So yeah, curious to hear your thoughts on that in the context of NHS, but maybe other public institutions and how they can help roll it out.
Brilliant question. So I will note that in the case of the NHS, there have actually been pilots to deploy Solid. The responsibility there is to have these institutions manage their data and make the data available in standardized formats, which is, as you can probably imagine, a very difficult and expensive problem, especially when you have doctors that just want to quickly enter their records and have a lot of free text and all this kind of stuff. So there's the responsibility angle of hosting. Now, not every institution necessarily needs to be a host. They can just make that data available to trusted pods, like in the Flanders use case. They've got the data utility company, and it can be the NHS sending that data to a trusted data utility company. And I'll let Lawrence, do you want to talk about the use case a bit more?
Sure. So we were very fortunate in Flanders that we already had quite a mature data standardization initiative in place that we could build upon. So we already had that infrastructure, that governance process. Lots of it was in place. It wasn't perfect, but we could build upon it. So that was an important driver in many of these use cases that we've rolled out. Another part was that the Flemish government chose to set up a spin-off company, a data utility company that actually provided these solid pods and this this data infrastructure for these use cases. We see that as a public player in the ecosystem. There could be other commercial entities also offering pods, going through a certification process and being part of this bigger ecosystem. But it was an important way to lower the barrier to entry from a technological and an infrastructure point of view. So we were fortunate because of the situation that we were in, and we also helped a bit with the adoption thanks to this setup of a data utility company to offer the initial infrastructure.
Cool. I think we're out of time. Yes, we're out of
Thank you
time.
very much. Sonia had to step out, so I've volunteered to take her place for the rest of the afternoon. I'm Andrew Betts. Thank you very much to our panel, and it has been fascinating to hear about Solid. Please join me in thanking the panel.